glad you could make it. Before you head into the bar for today's true crime story, just a warning that TCB might contain disturbing content, so it's not for kids. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
On a quiet dirt road in Brackney, Pennsylvania, two best friends went skeet shooting in the woods. One would walk away, but the other would not. Marty Dillon was a respected attorney, a father, and a husband. That day, after he was shot dead, the tragedy was ruled an accident. But the truth was far darker. Marty's best friend, Dr. Scher, told the authorities that Marty tripped while chasing a porcupine and his gun went off. And then for 2 decades, they believed him. Join us today for the doctor, the wife, and the setup. Secrets don't always stay buried forever. In fact, they seem to have a way of coming out eventually. This is especially true when a killer marries his victim's widow and then raises her children as his own. This is a twisted story of betrayal, obsession, and cold-blooded murder that was hidden in plain sight. So this was in a small community, very shocking for everyone there. I think people just had a hard time believing what happened.
Yeah, well, you have a respected doctor. Yeah, these two couples were both upstanding members of the community, right?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, definitely Marty was a good guy. But we're going to find out there were some dirty secrets going on in the background.
Oh, there certainly were.
Absolutely. So why don't you give us a beer review?
So we're going to have a Goza today. Those are beers that are lighter in alcohol and usually have a hint of salt. Very refreshing beers, particularly in the summer. So we're going to do a Goza called Kirsch Goza from Victory Brewing Company. Kirsch is German for cherry, I believe. So it's a dark pink color, lighter pink head, nice fruity aroma, tart cherry taste, pleasantly salty. Good beer to have for the summer. I mean, I know the calendar says it's fall, but it's still pretty warm down here.
Oh, absolutely. It'll be pretty warm down here until at least Halloween.
Yeah, we hope.
Right, yeah. Okay, well, I love a ghost, so let's do it. Open it up.
Okay.
So it does have that nice kind of fruity smell. And I kind of enjoy the salt as long as it's not too overwhelming. So
No, I don't think it is at all.
no, I think this could be quite enjoyable.
And you can notice it being a little salty, but it's certainly not dominant.
No, it's not at all. So how about we settle in and tell a story, because this is a story.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I always try and pick a case that has something interesting, something a little different, because it's about more than the murder, right? It's about the people, the community, what was going on. That's what it's all about.
It is.
Yep. So it was actually around noon on June 2nd, way back in 1976, when attorney Marty Dillon and his client Kendall Strawn finished up a real estate closing at a bank in Montrose, Pennsylvania. Montrose is a quiet town near the northeastern tip of the state, and for 30-year-old Marty, the workday was just coming to a close. Marty took off most Wednesday afternoons to skeet shoot with friends on some land that his parents owned. They called it Gunsmoke, and it was about 12 miles outside of town. A group of what Marty and his friends called the Wednesday Afternoon Club would take turns shooting clay pigeons, taking breaks for some beer and some cigarettes. Kendall Strawn didn't live in the area and wasn't part of the club, but he was a good friend, and Marty asked him to spend the afternoon at his family's camp. But Kendall couldn't take the afternoon off of work. He'd been working 7 days a week managing his properties, and he was running a farm he owned west of Montrose. So he barely found any time to spend with his wife Joan and his baby daughter. Kendall would recall feeling a touch of urgency in Marty's voice, but Marty smiled and let it go. So 3 of Marty's other friends couldn't make it that day either. This left Marty with just one member of the Wednesday Afternoon Club, and that was Dr. Stephen Scher, an allergist at Montrose General Hospital. So Kendall thought he understood the situation that Marty was dealing with, but since Marty didn't volunteer anything about it, he didn't ask him. When Dr. Stephen Scher's name was mentioned, Kendall was always careful about saying anything. He felt like a husband's denial had to be respected, and Marty would eventually come to terms with what was really going on between this Dr. Scher and Marty's wife, Pat. So after Kendall drove off, Marty headed to his law office. Since he returned to his hometown after graduating from law school just 5 years earlier, he'd had a partnership with Robert Dean. This was one of the most respected attorneys in the county. Marty's practice was very busy. Land prices in the area had been rising in the early 1970s, so the economy was really thriving. Marty handled about a dozen real estate closings per week, while his criminal defense practice was growing. So he was a busy guy.
Yeah, and it sounds like he's doing pretty well for himself.
Yeah, just 30 years old.
Yeah, 5 years out of law school. He's got a job with a very well-respected attorney.
Yeah.
They're clearly going to do well.
Yes. Now, at his desk that afternoon, Marty's mood improved when his secretary, Bonnie Meade, told him he had a call from Anthony Amendola. This was an old friend who'd moved to Florida but was back in town for the week. Marty immediately invited Anthony to go skeet shooting, but Anthony had a business meeting that afternoon and then he had dinner plans. So at this point, there really wasn't anyone left for Marty to ask to go along.
Yeah, he would want someone. He just didn't want to be by himself with Scher.
That's the vibe, right? You're picking up that vibe I'm laying down?
That's what you're telling me.
Yeah. Okay. That's right. So as he left for Gunsmoke that day, Marty ran into Pennsylvania State Troopers, John Faquette and John Salinkas, while he was walking out to his car. And the three men chatted for a few minutes. Then Marty got into his red BMW and headed off half a mile down the street, where he pulled into the driveway of a white two-family house across the street from Montrose General Hospital. So grabbing a change of clothes from his car, Marty climbed the front porch steps of the home of Dr. Stephen Scher, and there was Scher standing right in the doorway. So he was kind of an imposing figure. He was 6'1", 245 pounds.
Well, that's a bit overweight.
Yeah, he was overweight and kind of sloppy in appearance. He was 36 years old, but he just had this confidence about him. Some people thought he was arrogant and they didn't like him at all. But then there were others in Montrose, especially women, who thought highly of him. He was recently separated from his wife, Anne, so he had a very active social life. Marty went inside the home to change out of his suit into the clothes he'd brought for shooting, some corduroy pants, a blue shirt, and some boots. If he was uneasy being in the doctor's home, he seemed to hide it well. Maybe he was just used to it because he'd had plenty of practice. So today, like so many other times before, it was just easier to go along with the plans than to call it off and to have to give an explanation. So obviously Marty was very non-confrontational. Besides, he believed that the past didn't matter anymore. He was being optimistic. Just a week earlier, an ultimatum had been given and a promise had been made, and Marty had felt like he'd won. So when he walked out of the doctor's house, even though Scher had already loaded the guns and ammunition into his own car and was sitting in his driver's seat, Marty decided to take the first step toward being a more dominant person in this relationship with Scher. Marty motioned to his BMW. Behind the wheel of his sports car, with Scher riding as a passenger, Marty felt like he'd taken back some control. So after a quick stop to pick up a six-pack of Pabst Blue Ribbon, the two men made a 15-minute drive, eventually turning onto Russin Road, and this was a dirt path leading up the mountain. As they sped past the modest home of Andrew Russin, a 65-year-old retired mechanical engineer, Marty beeped his horn once, and Russin, who was weeding in his garden, looked up and waved at him. So Russin lived there with his wife Anna and their 21-year-old mentally disabled son David. So they kept an eye on Gunsmoke for the Dillon family, so they were pretty friendly. So Dr. Scher got out of the car to open the gate at the entrance to the Dillon property, and Marty's BMW pulled to a stop in front of a trailer that was surrounded by woods. The two men unloaded the car, bringing hamburger meat, ketchup, relish, bread, and chips into the small kitchen for a barbecue planned for that evening. The trailer was modestly furnished. It was really just a place to rest, use the bathroom, maybe have a bite to eat, and have a beer. So they sat out on the porch, opened beers, and smoked cigarettes for a few minutes. Then the two men each put a beer in their jacket pockets and walked a couple 100 feet up a wooded path to a clearing, carrying the guns, the clay birds, and the skeet machine. Marty brought along his sunglasses and a pair of gray and black ear protectors, too. So they set up the skeet at the edge of a field near a tree stump and took turns shooting 10 birds each. Then they drank another beer, ate some chips, smoked another cigarette. This was the 70s. A lot of smoking.
Right.
So it was just before 6 p.m., and Marty reached for the clay birds, holding one in each hand. His shirt caught the wind, billowing slightly away from his body. His foot turned inward as he squatted by the machine. Wearing the gray and black ear protectors and sunglasses, he lowered his head. It was his turn to load the skeet. Scher was standing about 4 feet away. He reached for a number 4 shell, which was much more powerful than the number 8s they ordinarily used for skeet shooting. So he loaded that into his 16-gauge shotgun, cocked it, and took aim. So the shotgun blast tore into Marty's chest, entering his body just above his sternum and ripping through his heart. Blood spattered onto his clothes, the instep of his left boot, the ear protectors and sunglasses he was wearing, and the tree stump that was beside him. Micro droplets of blood were in the air at least 5 feet around him, far enough to land on the jeans and boots of Dr. Scher. Then Marty dropped pretty much instantly, face down onto the ground. This was definitely a deadly shot.
Yeah, it tore through his heart.
Yeah, there was no saving him. But the echo of the gunshot faded, and then there was just silence. Scher took a deep breath. Everything was going according to plan. Now, just weeks earlier, Patricia Dillon, Marty's wife, had ended their year-long affair, and this was after Marty had finally demanded that she make a choice. She decided she would stay in her marriage, and she would call things off with the doctor. But now, in the pull of a trigger, that decision was moot. Now Scher could take what he believed was his due. He would now have the life he wanted, the life that had belonged to Marty Dillon. It was just by chance that Scher had gotten this chance to be alone with Marty and a gun out in the woods. But now, as the sun was beginning to set, Scher turned his focus to his own self-preservation.
You know, I'm interested in what would make a man whose wife had been having a long-term affair with this other guy. Why would you even want to do anything with the other guy? I wouldn't want to go shooting skeets with him.
No.
Or playing basketball or going to a movie. I wouldn't want to have anything to do with him.
Sure, I know, but Marty was just not confrontational at all, and he was trying to just get along. I mean, this affair had been going on a long time before Marty really did anything about it. He was in denial and maybe just a little bit afraid to say anything.
Possibly.
So before the state troopers arrived to tape off the scene, before the coroner was even called, and before Marty's family was notified, Scher had to have his story ready. With a single push, he rolled Marty's body onto his back. He laid down the 16-gauge Winchester several feet away, with the muzzle pointed toward his victim's head. Then he bent over and untied Marty's right shoelace. As he prepared to leave, he reached into Marty's pocket and took his car keys.
So at first, Andrew Russin didn't recognize Scher standing at his door. The Russins didn't get many visitors, living way up a dirt and gravel road in Silver Lake Township. Russin hadn't heard the BMW pull into the driveway. But he heard Scher. There was an accident, and Marty's dead. His voice, though, was flat and expressionless. He was shot. Now, Russin liked Marty, and the doctor's story was hard to believe. Scher told him he had tried giving mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and he had a ring of blood around his mouth. Then he told Russin to call for help. As Scher waited in the kitchen, Russin phoned the emergency number and reported an accident at Gunsmoke. Then Scher asked him to return with him to the Dillon property, and Ruskin agreed, telling his son David to join them. Russin and his son followed the BMW driven by Stephen Scher in Russin's 1966 white Jeep. About a half-mile up the road at the turn for Gunsmoke, Russin stopped and told David to get out and wait at the corner for the ambulance. Then Andrew Russin drove about a mile and a half to the Dillon trailer, and they followed the doctor by foot up the dirt path. Now, at first, Russin could only see a pair of boots, but as he continued up the slight upgrade, the crumpled figure on the ground came into view. The two men stood over the body. He fell on his gun, Dr. Scher said. He shot himself. And Andrew Russin nodded. He had no reason to question the doctor.
Well, he didn't. He didn't even know the doctor. So why would he question it? He took the blanket his wife had given him, and he did cover Marty's body. Scher walked up behind him, and out of the corner of his eye, Russin saw him picking up the 16-gauge Winchester. So as Russin watched, the doctor lifted the gun by the muzzle, raised it up like a baseball bat, and with full force he swung it directly into a tree. He broke it into 2 pieces, cracking it and sending it flying more than 20 feet away. "This goddamn gun will never kill again," he shouted. So a shocked and confused Andrew Russin only stared at the doctor. This behavior was just weird. But he did sigh with relief that the gun had not discharged accidentally, for a second time that day.
Yeah, it seems kind of remarkable.
That he did that?
That he did that.
Yeah.
I mean,
it was definitely an act.
Thinking he was going to destroy some evidence or something like that.
Absolutely. That's the first thing I thought of.
And it is a good act or a good scene. The gun killed him.
So I'm going to kill the gun.
So I'm going to, right.
Right. Yeah. It was really dramatic, I would guess. So at that point, the first EMTs, Don and Susan Strope, arrived on the scene. It had been Susan Strope who'd taken Russin's call on the emergency phone that she had installed in her own home. So talk about a small town, right?
I guess.
So this had broadcast over the radio a request for first responders to head over to the scene. Once at Gunsmoke, Don Strope jumped out as his wife parked by the trailer. When he reached the crest of the incline and saw the two men leaning over a body, one of them with his face and hands bloody, Strope quickly turned and held up his hand for his wife to stay back. He told her to help Scher. So the doctor walked along the trail towards Susan Strope and then turned and buried his face against a tree. He wrapped his arms around the trunk and began to cry. Susan Strope touched him gently on the shoulder, and she identified herself, explaining that she was with the rescue squad. She asked what she could do to help, and he said he was having chest pains. So he's gasping and sobbing. He says he has chest pains. So Susan Strope is concerned, and she asked him if he had a heart condition. He nodded. When she asked if he had any nitroglycerin pills, he told her he'd already taken 2. I'm a doctor, he explained. I'm Dr. Scher. Susan Strope had heard the name, but she'd never met Scher before. She led him to her car and motioned for him to sit in the passenger seat. When Scher saw the coroner arrive, then he began to cry. The tears came like full force. My best friend, he moaned. I can't believe he's dead. He was my best friend. So less than an hour after Stephen Scher shot Marty Dillon, the doctor felt like, yeah, I think I'm in the clear. His story in tears had been enough for John Connerton. That was the coroner. He was sold. And over the next half hour, other officials arrived on the scene. So the moment the coroner and a state trooper met up on the path, the coroner confidently shared exactly what Dr. Scher had told him happened. It's an accidental shooting, the coroner said. The trooper, who was a rookie, didn't even ask any questions. He'd never even been to the scene of a shooting before. As he followed the coroner up the trail, he learned that the distraught man sitting in the Strope's car was Dr. Stephen Scher, and he had been the only other person at Gunsmoke at the time of the shooting. But the coroner said, hey, this is all quite simple. Marty tripped. He fell and shot himself in the chest. It was an accident. At the scene, the trooper assumed jurisdiction for the Pennsylvania State Police, taking over from the game wardens, and he cordoned off the area. He walked over around the body. He saw the black and gray ear protectors and a pair of sunglasses that were streaked with blood, lying a few yards away. He saw the broken gun, the pump handle 6 feet from the body, and the stock another 25 feet away. Nearby, he could see a tree stump that was spattered with blood, and a second firearm, a double-barreled shotgun on top, with no rounds in either barrel. He saw that Marty's right shoelace was untied, and he asked Bob Elliott to clear the chamber of the Winchester. This was a game warden, and he did what he was told. He removed the number 4 shot expended cartridge from the barrel and a number 8 shot unexpended cartridge from the magazine. But nobody asked about that. The trooper asked Scher to follow him to his police car, and he did, getting into the passenger seat. The trooper and the coroner climbed into the back seat, and the trooper pulled out a pen and a pad of paper, asking Scher to tell him exactly what had happened that day.
Scher began to speak. He said they were walking down the trail, and he laid his gun on the stand. They passed coming down the trail. As they went a little farther, Marty turned around and he saw something in the open field, and that it might have been the porcupine that his dad had been after. Scher said that Marty ran up the trail, grabbed his gun from the stand, He heard him cock it. Then he heard the gun go off. So he went up the path. He saw Marty lying on the ground face down. He ran up to him and turned him over, saw him bleeding from his chest. He said he tried to stop the bleeding and gave Marty mouth to mouth. But he knew he was dead. Well, yeah, he's a doctor.
Yeah. And then after that, he turned to the coroner, who was nodding along. John, he said, I'm a doctor. I knew he was dead. Then I turned and started running down the trail, and I started to get chest pains. So I turned around, and I went back to get the car keys out of Marty's pocket. I then drove to the Russins' place and told them what had happened. Then me and Russin came back, and I took him to where Marty was. I looked down and saw the gun, and I picked it up and said, the goddamn trigger got a twig in it. And at the same time, I smashed it against the tree. I know I shouldn't have done that. But, the message there was he was just so emotional he couldn't help himself.
Yeah.
So his was a description of events that would ring hollow for those who understood guns and the trajectory of bullets. Also for those educated in blood spatter and crime scenes. But mostly the story of the porcupine in the woods and of Marty grabbing the doctor's gun off the stand and running with a loaded gun would immediately arouse suspicion in those who knew Stephen Scher and Marty Dillon. In the days that followed, as Scher repeated his account of that evening to friends, family, and authorities, the facts would change. They were small details, but that's how lies tend to work. They change a little bit. It would solidify the belief in many people that something very different than Scher had described had actually happened that day. For the next hour or so, the trooper, the coroner, and the game wardens continued to walk from the body to the trailer. They were taking measurements and photos and talking. Scher waited quietly by the cars. So while the authorities were up at the clearing, he felt like he could relax. He must have thought he was hidden from judgmental eyes. But he was wrong, because Carol Gazda was watching him. A volunteer first aid technician, she had been sitting in her car parked a few yards away from Scher for more than an hour. She'd arrived shortly after the Stropes. She'd heard the call over the radio and immediately headed over, taking along her 5-year-old daughter. But when Carol Gazda got to Gunsmoke and began walking up the path, she saw that her husband Tom was already on the scene. He saw her and waved her away, telling her to keep their daughter back from the crime scene. So Carol had grabbed her daughter's hand and led her back to the car. And she waited there, having really no idea what was going on. She didn't know who any of the people there were. She'd never met Marty Dillon or Stephen Scher. But Carol watched Scher's odd behavior. So he was a man sitting quietly and calmly, looking as if nothing was wrong. But then someone would come out from inside a trailer or from up the path, a trooper, the coroner, or an EMT, and the man in front of her, almost as if on cue, would suddenly begin to cry. And he'd sob, "My best friend, he was my best friend." So for a little more than an hour, Carol had watched Scher turn off and on at least half a dozen times, calm when alone, and breaking down as soon as anyone approached him. It was just the strangest thing Carol had ever seen. She felt like she was invisible. She was the only witness to this behavior, and for some reason, Scher didn't notice her sitting in her car. But, she really didn't have any idea what she was seeing until later. She just felt like something was wrong.
Well, yeah, if you're watching a person for a length of time and he's doing the actions that Scher did, that's really suspicious. I mean, he's calm and relaxed almost until someone comes from the site, and then he's sobbing uncontrollably.
Exactly, yeah.
Good actor.
Well, I don't know how good it was, but he wasn't afraid to do it anyway, right? He had some nerve.
That he did.
So really, by all accounts, Stephen Scher had charm, and he did have this ability to gain people's trust just in general. The only disagreement between his friends and detractors was whether he was being genuine. So Scher had been born to Jewish parents in Toronto, Canada. His sister Susan was 2.5 years younger than him. When he was 8, his family relocated to Florida for his father's job as a salesman. But 3 years later, out of town on a business trip, Scher's father, just in his early 40s, died of a massive heart attack, and the death really hit the family hard. The Schers had to move into a small apartment, and young Stephen began to work after school. Then, within 2 years, there were more major adjustments to make. His mother remarried, and he had a new stepfather and 2 new stepbrothers. For as long as he could remember, he'd wanted to become a doctor. And then, after his father's death, his determination only became stronger. He got good grades in high school, and he was able to become a U.S. citizen at age 16. Then he enrolled at the University of Miami. But just a month after school began, Scher's mother died of cancer. Without any other family members in the area, he and his sister left Florida. Susan went to live with an aunt in Toronto, and Stephen transferred his credits to the University of Michigan. So he moved in with an uncle who lived near Ann Arbor. But it was a very difficult time for him. Losing both of his parents so young had left him feeling adrift. With few friends and pretty much no money, he immersed himself in his courses. Then one night he went to a university dance and he met Edna Ann Elias, a bacteriology student. They dated, and soon they were a couple. So Scher was accepted at the university's medical school. And 1 year later, he and Ann, both 23 years old, got married. They rented a farm outside of Ann Arbor. Ann paid the bills and Scher worked part-time at the same clinic. After med school, he started to consider job offers in small communities where he could build his own family practice. Both of them preferred to live in the country, and they agreed to focus on the East Coast. Ann wanted somewhere where she could raise her dogs. She liked to raise and train and show dogs. So they ended up moving to Montrose, Pennsylvania. With a guaranteed income, the Schers bought a farm on the periphery of the town. They shared a common interest in medicine, and they would discuss the latest journals together. Scher took over another physician's practice in New Milford, which was just about 9 miles away. So he had 2 practices he was working. So he was working long hours and making house calls in the mornings, staying late into the evenings in his office. Some people, though, found him to be cold and distant. Still others liked him, but everybody really agreed that he was devoted to medicine. But then, a lot like his father, he had a heart attack when he was just 31.
That's pretty young.
Very young, but he did not live a healthy lifestyle either.
No, I mean, he's 250 pounds.
Smoker, heavy smoker.
And a smoker.
Yep. So he spent 3 weeks recovering, and once he went back to work, Ann noticed some big changes in her husband. He did lose some extra weight and stop smoking, but he also began to avoid having sex with her. She thought, well, maybe he's afraid he'll have a heart attack if we have sex. Then he started to talk about his belief that he would probably die young, just like his parents. Ann believed his reaction to his fear was for him to focus only on himself, his own needs, and what he wanted. She later told friends it was as if he'd made the decision that he was going to do whatever he wanted to do because his life was going to be short anyway. So it was really as if he took a dangerous turn and he started trusting no one. She was aware that her husband was a master at controlling situations and at manipulating people. She also knew that he had frequent mood swings, and he would just turn cold with no explanation. Then Scher began to treat her with a coldness that just stunned her, gradually just tearing down her self-esteem. He told Ann not to visit him at the clinic anymore. He would leave home on weekends to go bowling or play golf and not even tell her. He'd just go. Some nights he didn't come home at all. For a while, Ann held out hope that her marriage might get better. She hadn't been able to get pregnant, although at one time they had talked about adopting. But as the distance grew between them, Ann really sunk into depression. Scher would sometimes bring her sedatives and antidepressants from the hospital, but nothing seemed to help. And that's probably not the best way to go about it. She probably should have gone to a doctor and a therapist.
Yes, but that's not the way to try a course of antidepressants.
No, of course not.
Take it for a week and say it's not working, try something different. No.
Right. And still he was abusive. He was complaining that the house was messy, and it got to the point where he really couldn't stand the dogs. So the marriage was in trouble. Then Pat Dillon joined the nursing staff at Montrose General Hospital. And I think this is when they really started getting the affair going, at least starting to build like a flirtation and a friendship.
Yeah.
So Pat was petite with a soft voice and dark hair. She just returned to the area with her husband and their infant son after spending years in the Philadelphia area. So Pat had grown up as the adored daughter of John, a math teacher at her high school, and Laura, a homemaker who was known as a great cook. Patty was an only child until she was 12 when her parents adopted a son, Robbie. So the family, the Carvellers, were staunch Catholics who attended church regularly, and they lived in a large white shingled house with a big barn. Although the neighborhood did have a lot of children, Patty rarely played with any of them. She had a small circle of friends and spent most of her time with her closest friend. Around the neighborhood it was well known that Patty was spoiled by her parents, and her nickname was Laura's Little Princess, Laura being her mother. So as she entered her teens, Patty continued to distance herself from most of the young people in Montrose. They started to consider her to be a snob who looked down on them. As a teen, she was beautiful, with long brown hair flipped at the ends, kind of like Annette Funicello.
Probably 90% of our audience will not know who that was.
Annette Funicello is, right? Yeah. Well, she was a star, like in the 50s?
Yeah.
She was in the Mickey Mouse Club. She was kind of a big deal.
That's right.
But Patty seemed to have it all. It was her mom who encouraged her to study nursing, and that was the way she hoped her daughter would find a husband. And not just any guy, but she wanted Patty to marry a doctor. And really nothing else would be good enough. After graduating from high school, Patty attended the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing in Philadelphia. But Patty didn't fall in love with a medical student. Instead, she began to date Marty Dillon. And this was a guy she'd known from high school, where he'd been one grade ahead of her. This wasn't what her mother had planned, but she did like Marty. He was handsome and he was ambitious, and he had dreams of becoming a trial lawyer. So I guess that wasn't so shabby.
Yeah,
and
as long as
Patty's
he
mom was
becomes a
okay.
lawyer.
As long as a professional, right? Somebody who's going to make
That's
money
right.
and have some status in the community was pretty much what Laura wanted. So Marty was born to Larry Dillon, a shipyard worker, and his wife Jo in Delaware. After the birth of their son, the Dillons moved to Montrose. And there, Larry sold cars, delivered gasoline, and performed other odd jobs. 2 years after Marty was born, the Dillons had a daughter they named Joanne. The Dillons didn't have a lot of money, but they were a tight-knit family who enjoyed spending time together. From early childhood, father and son were really good friends. Larry taught Marty how to hunt, always stressing safety first. So that is significant. And Marty took these lessons seriously. Marty and his sister were also close. In high school, Marty played basketball and trombone in the band, and he was even elected class president. After school, he worked at the local Agway, stocking shelves and sweeping the floors. But Marty's real passion was always fast cars. After school, he loved drag racing with his friends outside of town. When he was done with high school, Marty enrolled at Villanova University near Philadelphia. He worked hard and he set his sights on law school. When he and Patty became serious, the Dillons were really happy. Joanne had always wanted a sister, and now she felt like she had one. Marty and Patty were married a week before Marty entered law school, and the newlyweds settled into an apartment in Philadelphia while Marty attended law school, and Pat took a nursing job. The early years of the Dillon marriage really seemed ideal. Patty became pregnant, and at the start of Marty's last semester of law school, their first child, Michael, was born. A few months later, after Marty graduated, the family decided to move back to Montrose. So hey, if you're a fan of True Crime Brewery, and you're here, so hopefully you are, maybe you can't get enough of our storytelling or thoughtful analysis of cases. You can satisfy that itch by subscribing to our premium show at tiegrabber.com/subscribe. Now, as a subscriber, you can enjoy every episode completely ad-free, so you can stay immersed in the details without any interruptions. This will also give you access to exclusive bonus episodes where we dive into some of the most fascinating and disturbing true crime cases. Your support not only helps keep the beer cold and the stories flowing, but it also gives us a chance to continue delivering the content you love. Whether you're in it for the psychology, the mystery, or hey, maybe just the craft beer pairings, subscribing is an effective way to show your appreciation and get even more of what makes True Crime Brewery so addictive. Why wait? Head right over to tiegrabber.com/subscribe and you can join the Tie Grabber community today.
A year after they moved back home, the young couple bought a 3-bedroom ranch home in a new development. Marty put in long hours at Bob Dean's law firm. Then in the evenings, he sometimes dropped by the Montrose Inn to hang out with his friends, have a few drinks, relax. And at first, Patty seemed to be finding her niche as well, arranging dinner parties and making contacts with established young couples. She also took a part-time nursing job at the hospital. But before long, something seemed to be missing for Patty. Marty was busy all the time, distracted by work, and he did not dote on her the way she had grown up believing a man would. And though she tried to fight it at first, she found herself becoming more attracted to a man who gave her the attention she needed. And who would that be? At first, Patty Dillon and Dr. Stephen Scher were friends. Scher met Marty, and for a while the two men seemed to be good friends. When Marty remodeled his basement into a rec room, Scher stopped by to help. But by the fall of 1972, nurses at the hospital noticed flirting and whispered conversations between Stephen Scher and Patty Dillon.
Yeah, and by this time, Patty was expecting her second child. As her pregnancy progressed, the nurses would watch as Dr. Scher would follow Patty around the hospital. Scher started to drop by her house in the mornings after Marty had left for the office. Marty went along with Pat's suggestion that they socialize with the Schers as couples, going to hockey games or out to dinner at the Montrose Inn. Now Marty appeared not to notice that when the foursome were together, it seemed like Steve and Patty were the couple, whispering and laughing together. But Ann Scher did notice, and she did not like it. From the start, she accused her husband of having an affair with the nurse, and he denied it. So by this point, miserable, Ann Scher lashed out at her husband, who was really just ignoring her at this point. Occasionally, he enjoyed making remarks just to increase her jealousy and to hint at his role as an almost surrogate father to little Michael Dillon. He would mention that he was helping Patty potty train her son, or that he was taking him out to teach him to ice skate. So this was all very strange.
Oh, strange, yes. Very calculated.
Absolutely. So feeling absolutely powerless, Anne sank deeper into depression. Scher continued to insinuate himself into Marty's family. It was never clearer than when Patty gave birth to her daughter that Scher was in love with her. When word of the birth of Suzanne Dillon reached the hospital, Dr. Scher immediately announced that he had to go and see the baby. "I'm her pediatrician," he told the nurses, and he practically ran out of the hospital. The nurses just kind of looked at each other like, "What the fuck? What's going on?" It was just crazy. He was not subtle in the least.
No, he wasn't.
So the receptionist and the switchboard operator that night just couldn't contain her shock. The hospital was filled with patients, and the only doctor who'd been on duty had just walked out. So she'd been observing the relationship between Scher and Patty, and she had not liked what she saw. She didn't care for Dr. Scher. She found him to be pompous. She really wasn't fond of Patty either. Now they had grown up next door to each other. Joanne saw Patty the same way as she'd been as a child. Pleasant, but someone who thought she was just a little better than everyone else. Joanne and many of the nurses shared their disbelief about the relationship between Dr. Scher and Patty. The doctor was overweight and dressed really sloppily. Nurses even whispered about his body odor and his dirty fingernails. They couldn't understand what the really put-together pretty Patty saw in this guy. But Patty Dillon liked something she was getting from Scher, possibly the attention she craved and the adoration that she was given as a child. She was headed down a dangerous path, though, and Marty Dillon refused to see what was happening. So by 1974, Scher was arranging Pat's schedule so that they worked the same shifts. When he was on call, he'd leave the receptionist a phone number where he could be reached. So at first, the receptionist didn't know whose number it was. Then she called one day, and she recognized Pat's voice. So the whispers about Scher and Pat were just all over the hospital. And Scher was hearing the rumors too. So she began to check up on her husband. And of course, it did not take long for her to find out about his lies, right?
Well, he wasn't being real careful about covering them up.
No.
Well, one thing he'd do, he said he's going to Syracuse for a medical meeting, and Ann could see that by the odometer on his car that he hadn't driven anywhere. One Sunday, when Scher told her he was working at the clinic, Ann called to speak to him. Receptionist Joanne Warner took the call. Ordinarily, she passed calls from wives directly to the doctors, So when Ann Scher called, she just told her the phone number Scher had given her, where he could be reached. And Ann recognized the Dillon's phone number. She'd made lunch for her husband that day, but he'd never shown up. Ann drove to the clinic and waited in the parking lot. Word traveled throughout the hospital that trouble was coming when Scher's car finally pulled into the lot. The nurses listened to Ann Scher confront her husband. Good theater, this, I'll bet.
Oh, yeah, this is just some great drama. It's like a soap opera, right?
Just about.
If it weren't real people's lives being destroyed, it would have just been entertaining. But a lot of the people were upset because they knew that people were being hurt by this, and it just wasn't appropriate at all. So in early 1975, Scher decided to specialize in allergies, and that's when he asked Pat to be his nurse. So once they were having a sexual relationship, their behavior was just becoming even more obvious. They were kind of like teenagers who couldn't get enough of each other. But still, Marty refused to face the truth. He put in longer hours at the office and began spending more time going to races on weekends and drinking with his friends at the Montrose Inn. He knew there was something wrong in his marriage, but he just could not imagine Patty being unfaithful to him. At the same time, Marty was just as confused by Scher's behavior. It was just difficult to believe that Scher, who called him for lunch, dropped by his office to chat, and sometimes joined him skeet shooting, would be sleeping with his wife behind his back. To Marty, he just couldn't believe anyone would do that.
Well, yeah, a good friend, maybe not best friend, but they're pretty good friends.
Pretty good friends.
They
and they were
socialized.
friends as couples, too.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was very disturbing, but Marty just took a long time to face up to it. His friend Kendall Strawn, though, really seemed to pick up on it much earlier. His curiosity about Pat and Scher being together had been growing. When Marty mentioned that his wife and the doctor were planning to go to a medical conference out of town, Kendall just knew something was weird about that. But since Marty didn't really seem concerned, Kendall shrugged it off. His suspicions really increased in the winter of 1975, and that's when Pat called him and encouraged him to go with Marty to a race in Florida. Then on the morning they were leaving, Marty told him that Pat's back was bothering her, and Dr. Scher had come by the house to put her in traction.
Whoa.
Yeah. So they're leaving town, and this guy's coming to the house.
Yep.
Kendall did not buy this at all. He actually sought out Pat, and he asked her about her back. He was very suspicious, and she seemed nervous and wouldn't look him in the eye. So he knew right then she was lying. His suspicions were confirmed that day. It was the spring of 1975, and the full-blown affair was underway for months. Scher and Pat told their spouses they were going to an allergy conference in Canada. Marty helped load his wife's suitcase into Scher's car. But Ann Scher begged her husband not to go. She pleaded with him to give their relationship another chance. But Scher didn't even answer her, and he just continued to pack for the trip. As his wife was becoming almost hysterical, he just coldly walked out of the house. Then later that day in the bathroom, Ann found a vial of about 40 yellow capsules of Nembutal.
It's a barbiturate. Think of more of an intermediate acting one.
So kind of a sedative.
Definitely.
So she'd never seen these pills in the house before, and she didn't take them. But she really believed that her husband had left them, hoping that she'd take them in like a suicidal attempt. He just wanted to get rid of her and did not care one bit. Just did not give one shit about her at all.
Well, probably 40 capsules would do it.
Absolutely, I would think so. So Ann Scher just cried all through that weekend, and meanwhile in Canada, her husband took Pat to meet some of his relatives in Toronto. In July, the Schers and the Dillons went to a resort in Wyoming where Pat and Scher were supposed to attend another allergy seminar. Before they left Montrose, Ann asked her husband what she'd been wanting to for months. She said, "Are you in love with Pat Dillon?" And he wouldn't admit it that day, but he soon would. During this trip with the four of them, Marty ran into Ann near the swimming pool one day, and Marty looked at her sadly and said, "Don't go over there." Ann went anyway, and she quickly saw what Marty had just seen. Her husband and Marty's wife were reclining on beach chairs by the pool, and Scher was massaging Pat's legs. Ann hurried back across the grass, and Marty told her he wanted to return to Montrose. So he was trying to get different plane reservations because he wanted to get Pat out of there, he said. After the Schers returned to Montrose, Anne asked her husband again if he was in love with Pat, and this time he said he was. 1 month later, Scher told his wife that he'd filed for divorce, and that Marty was his lawyer. He told her the proceedings would be handled fairly, and she didn't need her own attorney. Oh, sure. But none of it, Anne later learned, was true. Big surprise. She couldn't understand why Marty would have agreed to handle the divorce anyway, and she later decided this was a ploy just to keep her from talking to Marty and sharing her suspicions that their spouses were having an affair.
Well, yeah, but by this time it's fairly common knowledge.
Yeah, but Marty's in denial still.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was actually Bob Dean, Marty's associate, who filed the divorce papers for Scher. Even after he announced he was divorcing Anne, Scher didn't leave their farm for 2 months. Sometimes Anne thought he was trying to just make her go crazy. He finally left the day before Thanksgiving and said to her, "I'm going to reduce you to living in a rented room in Binghamton." I don't know what's wrong with Binghamton, but he said, "You'll be working the night shift flipping hamburgers at McDonald's."
Oh, it's a town in New York State.
Well, I guess he thought it was a bad place. It was a threat. But why would she be flipping hamburgers? This was an educated woman.
That's right.
He was just belittling her so horribly. At the hospital, the nurses were just amazed by how the couple was behaving. A nurse's aide assigned to Pat had never liked working for Pat and Scher. She told others she felt like a fifth wheel going along on a date with them. One day, she had just finished cleaning the emergency room when she walked into what was known as the drug room, where supplies were kept, and she saw Pat and Scher kissing in there. Elaine Henninger worked at the switchboard and as a receptionist, and she said nothing whenever Pat and Dr. Scher would go into room 13 just across from her desk, lock the door, and stay in there for up to an hour. Here we go again, she'd think. So she did resent that she was left to appease waiting patients. She didn't even look up when Scher and Patty would finally emerge from the room. Sandra Price, a registered nurse, saw Scher come up behind Pat, reach from behind, and squeeze her breasts. And she saw Pat turn, see the doctor, and giggle. Around the same time, another nurse, Betty Williams, was filling out an order for the clinic, and she walked into the drug room to find Pat on a stool, reaching for something, and Dr. Scher with his hands up her skirt. Another time, a nurse's aide witnessed almost exactly the same scenario. So this was very scandalous.
Good gossip material.
Absolutely. So in April of '76, Scher began to put together a plan to get what he wanted. He called a friend in New Mexico, whom he'd met when he was a public health service officer. Scher knew that the dry climate made it a good place for an allergy practice. And Scher wanted to know what he could expect in New Mexico, because it just sounded perfect. It seemed like a perfect plan. He could leave Montrose and start over. But, of course, he did not intend to go alone.
Oh, no. He's going to take Pat with him.
Absolutely.
Or that's his plan.
His plan is to take Pat and the kids. So Marty's got to get out of the way. But by this time for Marty, the humiliation had really reached a peak. Now even his parents knew what was going on with Pat and Scher. And they were very troubled by all the talk in town. Not long after Scher had moved out, Anne had cornered Marty's sister and told her that Scher was having an affair with Pat. When the Dillons confronted their son and daughter-in-law, Pat ordered them out of the house. "How dare you say that? Get the hell out of my house." I can just picture it.
Yep.
Marty later conceded that there were problems in his marriage, but, he felt really embarrassed and bad. He reassured his parents that things would work out. But his dad, Larry, was furious at his daughter-in-law. He found her behavior to be disgraceful. And these are strict Catholics, by the way. Then one night, not long before Marty's death, Jo Dillon, his mom, saw the light on in her son's house and decided to drop in. When she entered, she found Pat and Scher sipping wine on the basement couch while Marty was upstairs sleeping. So Pat was furious and Jo was just heartbroken, and she left. But can you imagine? He's sleeping and they're drinking wine in his house. It's just very shitty.
Yeah, it is.
It's really not
I
nice.
guess the only thing worse would be to find them naked on the couch together.
Well, maybe her timing just wasn't right. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
So now by May of '76, Marty felt like he could no longer hide from the truth. 1 week after his 30th birthday, he changed his $50,000 life insurance policy, making his children his beneficiaries instead of Pat. The marriage, he decided, was over. But in the last weeks of his life, Marty must have had a change of heart. So he gave Pat an ultimatum. It was him or Scher. When Marty finally gathered the strength to confront her, Pat said she didn't want a divorce. She told him she would stay with him and they would remain a family. So whether she admitted the affair or continued to deny it to Marty, only the two of them would know. But she told Scher the affair with him was over and that she would not be moving with him to New Mexico. And you can imagine he was not happy to hear that.
But he didn't like that.
No. So she told Scher she couldn't get a divorce, that she couldn't go against the tenets of Catholicism. Patty was not prepared to leave her husband. She couldn't face her family or the people in town, and a part of her still did love Marty. But Scher couldn't understand this. He was not hearing what he wanted to hear. So just a few weeks before June 2nd, Scher went to visit a friend who was a devout Catholic and a longtime patient of his. Scher said he wanted to understand Catholicism, and he asked if Pat could be a practicing Catholic if they moved to another state. But he was told no, her record would follow her, and she couldn't go to confession and receive the sacraments of the church.
So the record being that she was a divorcee.
Yes. Yes, she couldn't be a divorcee.
She could go to New Mexico and attend church. She just couldn't go to confession.
Well, yeah, but if she's going to do that, she really would need to end up getting divorced.
Right.
And of course, this was just not the answer that Scher wanted to hear, and he decided to come up with a new plan. So that's when the events at Gunsmoke happened, and Marty Dillon was killed.
And it was termed an accident.
Yes.
At least at that point.
At that point. So that evening after the shooting, it was about 7 p.m. when two police officers rang the doorbell at Larry and Joe Dillon's house. When Larry saw the officers, he really wasn't worried right away because Larry was the town's mayor and it wasn't unusual to have the police come to his door. But soon his world was shattered. He and his wife held each other, praying that this was a terrible mistake. But their son, the officers said, was dead. He had died in a shooting at Gunsmoke.
So word of Marty's death traveled quickly in the small town. But the horror of the news was worse for those who had long suspected an affair between Scher and Pat. They believed the doctor would be capable of anything. For them, Scher's account of what happened was dismissed as fiction. When Pat called Kendall Shawn later that evening and told him there had been an accident at Gunsmoke and Marty was dead, Kendall listened silently, regretting his decision not to shoot skeet with Marty that day. And it wasn't only friends of Marty's who were suspicious. A trooper at Gunsmoke, unaware of any motive Scher might have had to kill Dillon, pointed out numerous inconsistencies with Scher's story of the victim falling on his gun.
Yeah, this was just really, we're going to find out it was physically impossible for it to have happened that way.
Yeah, it took him a little time to get to that point.
It took a long time, yes. But the trooper said to the coroner, this just could not have happened this way. And he pointed to Marty's untied shoelace. The boot itself was still tight on his leg. The laces were just untied and laid that way. If he'd been running, the top of the boot and the rest of the lacing would have opened. He also noticed that the unbroken clay birds under the body's left arm by the wrist, and the skeet throwing machine just 6 feet away. Off from the right hand, about 3 feet from the body, he saw the set of ear protectors and sunglasses that were spattered with blood. He could easily make out the markings on Marty's head where it had been worn, and it was the only area that was not spattered with blood. The victim had been wearing the ear protectors and someone had to take them off. The position of Marty's body on his back with his arms outstretched and the large hole in the center of his chest were not consistent with a contact wound and not compatible with the story told by Dr. Scher. It was too big of a wound to be a contact wound, and Marty was also killed with Scher's gun, so that was weird.
Yeah.
Why would he be carrying that gun when he owned his own that was right there?
Good question.
Then also, why would Scher smash that gun against a tree? It was very strange that Pat did not find her husband's death suspicious. The timing was strange, and she knew that Marty was very safety conscious with guns. But if she suspected that Stephen Scher was lying, she showed no signs of it, not even on the evening of Marty's death, and really not even for the rest of her life. On the same evening Marty was killed, Ann Scher overdosed on sleeping pills. A friend found her and called the ambulance. Scher told the police that he had talked to some of her friends. He said that she raises dogs and one died and she'd gone downhill since. So within 6 weeks of Marty's death, Pat Dillon took her children and moved into an apartment, and it was about a 3-hour drive from Montrose. She sold Marty's red BMW, and she told Kendall Schron that he should keep the race car that he and Marty had bought together. She told him Marty would have wanted him to have it. Pat would get nothing from Marty's $50,000 life insurance policy. Once his death was ruled an accident, the money was placed in trust for his children, Michael and Suzanne, until they were 21. So Pat trusted Scher and believed him. When some of her friends questioned his frequent visits to her place, Pat was defensive and said that she was alone with 2 small children, and he was the only one willing to help her. So that's hard to believe.
Just a bit.
Yeah. In private, she really just may have rationalized that Marty hadn't been there for her, that he had kind of pushed her aside and didn't appreciate or love her. She had been lonely in her marriage, and so had Scher, apparently. And her whole idea was that they came together out of need. So over Thanksgiving weekend, just 5 months after Marty's death, Pat went shopping with Scher at a department store in Philadelphia. So as they browsed through the lingerie department, Pat held up a cream-colored lace nightgown, and Scher was seen nodding his approval. Because just a few yards away, neighbors who lived in Montrose and had actually known Pat, Marty, and Dr. Scher were horrified. They did not approach Scher and Pat, but they did share what they'd seen with others around town. So the rumor mill was back in action.
I bet it was going full speed.
Yep.
So Scher and Pat stayed in constant contact after he left Montrose in early January to move to New Mexico. He moved into an apartment, opened his office, and within a short time he had built a growing practice. He and Pat talked daily on the phone. Then the following May, Scher suffered his second heart attack, and Pat flew to his side. A few weeks later, Scher returned to the East Coast to see a cardiologist at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital and stayed with Pat and the children for about a month.
Whoa, well then you know something's going on at that point. But I don't think they were even really trying to hide it.
No, once Marty died, while he might get looked at a little sideways, they don't care.
No, they really didn't seem to care. A few months later, Scher flew to Philadelphia and took Pat to a bar mitzvah for his cousin's daughter in New Jersey. The following April, Pat visited New Mexico for a few days. And it was during this visit that the couple decided to get married. By now, almost 2 years had passed since Marty's death, so I guess it seemed to them they'd waited long enough. So 2 months later, Stephen Scher and Pat were married in New Mexico in a ceremony attended by Michael, who was now age 7, and Suzanne, age 5. For the Dillon children, memories of their father had just faded. Marty's parents found out about the wedding when Joe tried to reach Pat at her apartment in Pennsylvania. And the landlord told her that Pat and the children had moved. So Joe called her daughter and asked her to call Pat's mother. But when she reached Laura Carveller, Pat's mother, she was evasive and actually refused to tell her where Pat had moved to. So that was strange. There shouldn't have been any bad blood there. She said that the Dillons would receive a letter in the mail from Pat. And sure enough, 2 days later they did. By then, though, Larry and Joe had already heard from others in town that Pat was in New Mexico and married to Stephen Scher. In the letter that Pat sent them, she was defensive, and she said it was really pointless to talk face to face. But she did say that they were welcome to visit their grandchildren in New Mexico any time.
For a few years after his son's death, Larry Dillon went to the office of Marty's former partner, Bob Dean, practically every week, urging Dean to help him get the Pennsylvania State Police to investigate the shooting of Marty. Dean was active in local politics, so his support could have made a difference. But Bob Dean was convinced that Scher was incapable of murder. He thought it was a suicide, even though the physical evidence contradicted that theory.
It contradicted it quite strongly. Detective Jock Collier and Secretary Bonnie Meade felt just as strongly as Larry did that Scher had killed Marty. Collier was extremely frustrated by not being able to convince the DA and the state police to examine the case. It really bothered him that it wasn't within his jurisdiction. The Pennsylvania State Police were clear that the death was accidental. Throughout the summer following Marty's death, Scher had kept a low profile in town, trying to steer clear of Collier. The detective continued to call him, though, repeatedly asking him to return for further questioning. But on advice of his lawyer, he said he would not speak about that day at Gunsmoke. Collier did keep the pressure on because he was disturbed when Scher moved away to New Mexico, and he called the local and state police in New Mexico to let them know that the doctor was suspected of a homicide. Now, for her part, Ann Scher really was not surprised to hear of her former husband's marriage to Pat. In the 2 years since the divorce, her life had changed dramatically. Now she was planning her own wedding. Her husband-to-be, John Vitale, was a wealthy man 27 years older than she,
Wow.
and he was the owner of 2 Ford dealerships in Montrose. So Vitale had actually begun to check on Ann after that suicide attempt that she made. He didn't really know her well, but he was concerned by what he'd heard around town, and he just wanted Ann to know that she had a friend. Now, he too had been going through difficult times. His wife of many years had died just the previous February, so he was lonely too. He was very patient and kind with her, and he made her laugh, and Ann gradually realized that she was suffering from low self-esteem. As she regained confidence in herself, she realized that, there were actually many people who did care about her. So Pat and Scher had bought a house in New Mexico and enrolled Michael and Suzanne in Catholic school there. They'd also joined a church. A year after Pat and Scher married, John and Laura Carveller sold their house in Montrose, and they relocated to New Mexico. Then Pat's brother and his wife moved west. Pat's parents were pleased to see their daughter remarried. To them, Scher was a perfect man for her. Remember, her mom always wanted her to marry a doctor.
But settled for the lawyer.
Yep. So in the months before he left Montrose, he had often visited them at their home, and Laura had even cooked for him. The Carvellers were convinced that the talk of an affair between the two was absolutely ridiculous. Poppycock, she called it.
Yes.
Yes, because Patty was just not that kind of girl. So the Scher they knew was kind and thoughtful, and he treated Patty's children as if they were his own. And of course, yes, he was a doctor. But, he'd wanted to take that whole family from the beginning, I think. He wanted to be the father to those children.
He sure did.
Then, in the fall of 1980, the Scher family grew. At the hospital one night, Scher heard about a newborn boy whose mother was planning to put him up for adoption. So Jonathan was just 3 days old when the Schers brought him home. By then, Michael was 9 and Suzanne was 7. The Dillon children were just thrilled with their new brother, and the Schers were living a really good life. He drove a high-end steel gray Mercedes, and Pat kept busy with the children, sometimes helping out at her husband's office. They seemed happy. But who wasn't happy? Marty's parents, and a lot of people who cared about Marty.
I can see where they'd be doing that.
So Joe and Larry Dillon hired a private investigator to look into Marty's death. And soon after, the DA spent 3 hours with Larry and Joe Dillon, hearing their concerns about their son's death. When he left, they felt some hope, because the DA had seemed interested in what they had to say. On the same evening Marty was killed, Ann Scher overdosed on sleeping pills. A friend found her and called the ambulance. Scher told the police that he had talked to some of her friends. He said that she raises dogs and one died and she'd gone downhill since. So within 6 weeks of Marty's death, Pat Dillon took her children and moved into an apartment, and it was about a 3-hour drive from Montrose. She sold Marty's red BMW, and she told Kendall Schron that he should keep the race car that he and Marty had bought together. She told him Marty would have wanted him to have it. Pat would get nothing from Marty's $50,000 life insurance policy. Once his death was ruled an accident, the money was placed in trust for his children, Michael and Suzanne, until they were 21. So Pat trusted Scher and believed him. When some of her friends questioned his frequent visits to her place, Pat was defensive and said that she was alone with 2 small children, and he was the only one willing to help her. So that's hard to believe.
Just a bit.
Yeah. In private, she really just may have rationalized that Marty hadn't been there for her, that he had kind of pushed her aside and didn't appreciate or love her. She had been lonely in her marriage, and so had Scher, apparently. And her whole idea was that they came together out of need. So over Thanksgiving weekend, just 5 months after Marty's death, Pat went shopping with Scher at a department store in Philadelphia. So as they browsed through the lingerie department, Pat held up a cream-colored lace nightgown, and Scher was seen nodding his approval. Because just a few yards away, neighbors who lived in Montrose and had actually known Pat, Marty, and Dr. Scher were horrified. They did not approach Scher and Pat, but they did share what they'd seen with others around town. So the rumor mill was back in action.
I bet it was going full speed.
Yep.
So Scher and Pat stayed in constant contact after he left Montrose in early January to move to New Mexico. He moved into an apartment, opened his office, and within a short time he had built a growing practice. He and Pat talked daily on the phone. Then the following May, Scher suffered his second heart attack, and Pat flew to his side. A few weeks later, Scher returned to the East Coast to see a cardiologist at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital and stayed with Pat and the children for about a month.
Whoa, well then you know something's going on at that point. But I don't think they were even really trying to hide it.
No, once Marty died, why you might get looked at a little sideways,
Yeah.
they don't care.
No, they really didn't seem to care. A few months later, Scher flew to Philadelphia and took Pat to a bar mitzvah for his cousin's daughter in New Jersey. The following April, Pat visited New Mexico for a few days, and it was during this visit that the couple decided to get married. By now, almost 2 years had passed since Marty's death, so I guess it seemed to them they'd waited long enough. So 2 months later, Stephen Scher and Pat were married in New Mexico in a ceremony attended by Michael, who was now age 7, and Suzanne, age 5. For the Dillon children, memories of their father had just faded. Marty's parents found out about the wedding when Joe tried to reach Pat at her apartment in Pennsylvania, and the landlord told her that Pat and the children had moved. So Joe called her daughter and asked her to call Pat's mother. But when she reached Laura Carveller, Pat's mother, she was evasive and actually refused to tell her where Pat had moved to. So that was strange. There shouldn't have been any bad blood there. She said that the Dillons would receive a letter in the mail from Pat. And sure enough, 2 days later they did. By then, though, Larry and Joe had already heard from others in town that Pat was in New Mexico and married to Stephen Scher. In the letter that Pat sent them, she was defensive, and she said it was really pointless to talk face to face. But she did say that they were welcome to visit their grandchildren in New Mexico anytime.
For a few years after his son's death, Larry Dillon went to the office of Marty's former partner, Bob Dean, practically every week, urging Dean to help him get the Pennsylvania State Police to investigate the shooting of Marty. Dean was active in local politics, so his support could have made a difference, but Bob Dean was convinced that Scher was incapable of murder. He thought it was a suicide, even though the physical evidence contradicted that theory.
It contradicted it quite strongly. Detective Jock Collier and Secretary Bonnie Meade felt just as strongly as Larry did that Scher had killed Marty. Collier was extremely frustrated by not being able to convince the DA and the state police to examine the case. It really bothered him that it wasn't within his jurisdiction. The Pennsylvania State Police were clear that the death was accidental. Throughout the summer following Marty's death, Scher had kept a low profile in town, trying to steer clear of Collier. The detective continued to call him, though, repeatedly asking him to return for further questioning. But on advice of his lawyer, he said he would not speak about that day at Gunsmoke. Collier did keep the pressure on because he was disturbed when Scher moved away to New Mexico, and he called the local and state police in New Mexico to let them know that the doctor was suspected of a homicide. Now, for her part, Ann Scher really was not surprised to hear of her former husband's marriage to Pat. In the 2 years since the divorce, her life had changed dramatically. Now she was planning her own wedding. Her husband-to-be, John Vitale, was a wealthy man 27 years older than she,
Wow.
and he was the owner of 2 Ford dealerships in Montrose. So Vitale had actually begun to check on Ann after that suicide attempt that she made. He didn't really know her well, but he was concerned by what he'd heard around town, and he just wanted Ann to know that she had a friend. Now, he too had been going through difficult times. His wife of many years had died just the previous February, so he was lonely too. He was very patient and kind with her, and he made her laugh, and Ann gradually realized that she was suffering from low self-esteem. As she regained confidence in herself, she realized that, there were actually many people who did care about her. So Pat and Scher had bought a house in New Mexico and enrolled Michael and Suzanne in Catholic school there. They'd also joined a church. A year after Pat and Scher married, John and Laura Carveller sold their house in Montrose, and they relocated to New Mexico. Then Pat's brother and his wife moved west. Pat's parents were pleased to see their daughter remarried. To them, Scher was a perfect man for her. Remember, her mom always wanted her to marry a doctor.
But settled for the lawyer.
Yeah. So in the months before he left Montrose, he had often visited them at their home, and Laura had even cooked for him. The Carvellers were convinced that the talk of an affair between the two was absolutely ridiculous. Poppycock, she called it.
Yes.
Yes, because Patty was just not that kind of girl. So the Scher they knew was kind and thoughtful, and he treated Patty's children as if they were his own. And of course, yes, he was a doctor. But, he'd wanted to take that whole family from the beginning, I think. He wanted to be the father to those children.
He sure did.
Then, in the fall of 1980, the Scher family grew. At the hospital one night, Scher heard about a newborn boy whose mother was planning to put him up for adoption. So Jonathan was just 3 days old when the Schers brought him home. By then, Michael was 9 and Suzanne was 7. The Dillon children were just thrilled with their new brother, and the Schers were living a really good life. He drove a high-end steel gray Mercedes, and Pat kept busy with the children, sometimes helping out at her husband's office. They seemed happy. But you know who wasn't happy? Marty's parents, and a lot of people who cared about Marty. So Joe and Larry Dillon hired a private investigator to look into Marty's death, and soon after, the DA spent 3 hours with Larry and Joe Dillon, hearing their concerns about their son's death. When he left, they felt some hope, because the DA had seemed interested in what they had to say. At the end of April, the DA and 3 investigators drove to the University of Pennsylvania, and this was for a presentation to 29 medical examiners and forensic pathologists. Among them was Dr. Isidore Mihalakis, a leading forensic pathologist. Mihalakis had consulted with the Montrose coroner back in 1976, when the coroner called to ask what to look for in an accidental shooting. By a show of hands, a majority of the specialists agreed that the manner of death had been a homicide. A smaller number chose suicide or accident. But in a letter dated May 24, 1989, the DA offered little optimism that criminal charges could ever be brought against Scher. He claimed that the medical experts had concluded that the manner of death was either accidental or self-inflicted. The DA's letter devastated the Dillons. By mid-July of that year, their private investigator was doing ballistics testing. Using the same make and model gun, the PI shot into pigskin to attempt to simulate the same-sized wound found in Marty Dillon's chest. The investigator had to move back 3 to 5 feet away to create a hole of 1 1/4 inch. So the PI later shared his findings with 2 forensic pathologists. And in the end, they all agreed it was impossible for the shooting to have been an accident. Of course, this conclusion didn't surprise Larry Dillon at all. He'd known it all along. Later that summer, he and his son-in-law went to see Dr. Grace, who performed the autopsy on Marty, and asked him to share any information he had. At one point, Dr. Grace told the two that he thought Marty had used poor judgment in going shooting alone with Scher. A few weeks later, the Dillons asked the coroner to come to their house. Joe, who'd begun to keep a diary of the investigation, later wrote that the coroner acted nervous throughout this visit, and Larry told him that they were not satisfied with the investigation into Marty's death. So in January of 1990, 1 year after he'd been hired, the private eye pulled everything together in a report. So his judgment was firm. Marty's death had been a homicide. He sent a copy of his report to the Pennsylvania State Police. By now, the Dillons had a surprising new supporter. That coroner that was first there, John Connerton. After he'd finally read the report, the coroner changed his mind. He then went to see the DA. After much discussion, it was decided that Corporal Richard Kane would approach Dr. Scher in New Mexico and attempt to have him sign the statement that he'd given to Detective Collier back in '76. So the corporal flew to New Mexico in April and went directly to the police. Then 2 officers went with him to Dr. Scher's allergy office. When the corporal identified himself to the receptionist in the waiting room, Dr. Scher, upon hearing the news, barricaded himself in the back, and he called his attorney, Peter O'Malley, in Pennsylvania. O'Malley told him to put the corporal on the phone, and the attorney was just furious. Corporal Kane explained that he had an unsigned statement that the doctor had given in 1976, and the state police just wanted his signature and a chance to ask a few more questions. O'Malley told him Scher wouldn't sign or say anything. He told the corporal he was on private property and he needed to leave immediately. So it wasn't until 3 months later, in May of 1991, that the state police finally sent evidence to the FBI lab. When the report came back, the results were stunning. Scher's boots had high-velocity blood spatter, which revealed that he had been within a few feet of the victim. The report also stated that the spatter on the tree stump and on the instep of Dillon's shoe suggested that he was sitting or squatting near the log, not running. Ballistics experts had reassembled Scher's broken shotgun and test-fired it, determining the muzzle was up to 3 feet away when it was fired. So at this point, Scher knew nothing about what was happening back in Montrose. The visit from Corporal Kane had really rattled him. But Scher was living his life without fear of being arrested up until then.
Yeah, he'd gotten away with it for, 16 years or so. So he's probably thinking he's in the clear.
Yeah. Over the summer of '92, Larry and Joe Dillon learned from their grandson, Michael Dillon, that Pat and Scher had moved to North Carolina, where Scher was taking over another practice. The local newspaper there published a story about his arrival, and patients began calling to set up appointments. So once a month for a few days, Scher commuted to New Mexico to work in his original office. And financially, the Schers were doing very well.
Yeah, allergists do pretty well.
Yeah.
In terms of annual income.
Well, there are a lot of procedures they can do.
Yeah.
Which are money-making, right?
Right. All the skin testing and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, a hearing was held when the Dillons requested an exhumation of Marty's body for a new autopsy. So it was April 29th, 1995, and the steel vault containing his casket was raised from the ground, loaded onto a truck, and taken to Lehigh University Medical Center. For the next 6 hours, Dr. Mihalakis searched for answers. He measured the length of the arms and examined the type and size of the wound and its characteristics. He performed microscopic analysis of the skin at the impact area, looking for powder burns and gunpowder residue and their location on the body. So by 4 o'clock that day, the doctor was done, and the body was on its way back to Montrose. So an interesting thing that was mentioned here is that when they brought him up, his body was pretty much just as it had looked at the funeral.
Good job from the embalmer.
I guess. I just think it's kind of creepy. I have no desire for an open casket. I just don't like that. It's just kind of gross. I don't know. I don't like that. But they have like this new, what do they call it? Organic or natural burial, something like that.
Yeah.
Where they just bury you, not embalmed and all that, wrapped in like a cloth or something. So you're not taking up the earth forever. So I would prefer that, just so you know.
Duly noted.
Okay. So in May, Dr. Mihalakis submitted his report to the state police and coroner. He determined that Marty could not have accidentally pulled the trigger if he had fallen over that 16-gauge shotgun. He would have hit the ground before the gun. There were no grass or dirt stains on his clothing or hands, suggesting he had fallen. It was also not possible that Marty had snagged the weapon trigger on a branch. Tests showed no gunpowder residue on the body, and the spread of pellet wounds suggested that the shot was fired from 3 to 5 feet away. The doctor also concluded that investigators were unable to recreate dropping the weapon so that it would discharge upon hitting the ground. The weight of the weapon would have caused the barrel to have pointed down if it had been dropped. So in the end, they found that evidence suggested Marty was crouched with his shirt billowing away from his chest when he was shot, and that the shot had destroyed his heart. There were no burn marks on his clothing or skin, no marks a gun muzzle would have caused the victim to fall on his weapon, and no blood on the gun barrel. When Scher learned about the coroner's report, he wasn't thrilled. He learned in a phone call from his attorney, Peter O'Malley. O'Malley told him to get out of North Carolina and surrender himself in Pennsylvania.
I'm sure that's exactly what Scher wanted to hear.
Right. No, he was really scared. So Scher and his attorney gave a press conference, but the police were not ready to arrest him. He went back to North Carolina, where he was eventually arrested. And following the arrest, Scher was taken to the local court where arrest papers were processed. And then he was escorted to the Lincoln County Jail. Amazing. He did fight extradition to Pennsylvania. The last thing he wanted was to tell his account of what happened at Gunsmoke to a jury. But he was extradited and taken for a 10-hour drive back to Montrose. The trip ended at the state police barracks where Scher was fingerprinted and photographed. He was then transported to the district justice's courtroom, which was not far from Montrose. In leg irons and handcuffs, holding a copy of the New American Bible, Scher was arraigned on charges that he had murdered Marty Dillon on June 2, 1976. And within days of her husband's arrest, Pat called friends and family and asked that they come to Montrose so they could testify at a bail hearing about Scher's character and his good reputation. So one by one, everyone she called agreed immediately. But bail was set for $1 million, and he was not happy with that. He was eventually able to get the amount reduced, though, and he did walk free on bail.
Scher's trial was scheduled for September 1997. The trial was expected to last from 4 to 6 weeks. Just days before jury selection, Scher and his attorney sat down to review their defense. The defense would concede that there had been a sexual relationship between Scher and Pat Dillon. The prosecution's witnesses, who had lived nearby or worked in Montrose General Hospital, would convince the jury anyway. If he could convince the jury that what they would hear from the defense was the truth, he believed they had their best chance. Scher must have realized that his account of what happened on June 2, 1976 was just not credible. In the days before the trial, he admitted he had lied about what happened at Gunsmoke. So the story changed again.
It sure did. So opening arguments began on the morning of September 22nd, and the Commonwealth went first. The prosecutor, Robert Campolongo, told the jurors that he would present them with a table of contents, an easy reference guide to the witnesses that they would hear. He explained that this would help them put together the pieces of the puzzle in this homicide. So he talked about Scher and his affair with Pat Dillon. Then he recounted a bit about Marty Dillon. A simple man, he called him, who loved his children and his wife, who always thought the best of people. A man who didn't want to believe that there were people who had evil in their hearts, even though on the outside they were full of smiles. He told the jury that Scher and Patty started having an affair, a sexual affair, but the sexual affair was not a discreet one. He told the jury that Patty had told Scher just weeks before her husband's death that she could not leave town with him, that she was staying with Marty. Marty, he told the jurors, had issued an ultimatum to his wife, and she had said that she would choose him. But Scher couldn't accept this because this was someone telling him that he could not have what he wanted. Then Campolongo took the jury through the events of June 2nd. He talked about how Marty was uncomfortable about going shooting alone with Scher, how he had invited numerous friends, practically begging them to join him. But when they didn't, Marty went anyway, not believing that any harm could come to him from Stephen Scher. Then he went through the shooting and all of the forensic results, which were very convincing. So when it was time for the defense to give their statement, to the surprise of many in the courtroom, the defense attorney told the jury that Scher and Patty Dillon were having an affair during the last year of her marriage. He told them they would hear that from Scher himself. Then he went on to discuss the experts who the defense would present. And they had actually gotten some big names. They got Dr. Cyril Weck and Dr. Michael Baden and Dr. John Shane. He told them they would learn that the Winchester is dangerously designed. Their expert examined the gun that caused Marty's death and found it was filled with dirt and grime, which would increase the possibility of an accident. He recounted what went on after Marty's death and how Coroner Connerton had ruled it an accident. But in the days that followed, one by one, nurses, former neighbors, and friends stepped up to the witness box for the prosecution and shared what they knew about the love affair between Dr. Scher and Patty Dillon. Then, the week after that, expert witnesses took the stand. The statement Scher gave to the state police was read into evidence. The clothing, the Winchester, and the spent Magnum load were shown to the jury. When large photos of the body of Marty Dillon were displayed, his daughter Suzanne hung her head. Dr. Mihalakis spent more than a day on the witness stand and endured intense cross-examination. The attorney struggled to cast doubt on the doctor's contention that the gunshot had been from at least 3 feet away, and there were no powder burns to suggest a contact wound. But he was very firm in his conclusions. So it was in early October when the prosecution rested, and then it was the defense's turn. And their first witness was Dr. Stephen Scher himself. Under direct examination, his voice was calm, and he began recounting his early years growing up in Toronto and Florida, the death of his parents, his medical training, and his marriage. He told the jury that he and Anne had just grown apart. He'd been working too much, and he admitted having an affair with Pat, but insisted they weren't really in love at the time. It was only a sexual relationship. Now, why would that sound better?
Yeah.
Kind of sounds worse. So he told the jury he wasn't interested in getting involved with anyone, but he was just emerging from a bad marriage. Then Scher began to talk about June 2nd, 1976. He said it had been Marty who'd arranged the skeet shooting outing, and that after the various friends dropped out, Scher said he hadn't even really wanted to go at all. It was cold and overcast that day. But he explained that Marty had shown up at his house in the BMW and had already bought hamburger meat for a barbecue and didn't want to waste it. And so, Scher told the jury, he went. So Scher described the drive to Gunsmoke and how they shot the clay pigeons for a while. Then he told the jury a story that no one had heard before. He claimed that Marty Dillon's mood had changed abruptly, and without warning, Marty confronted him about the affair. Then Scher said he had admitted to it. He said that Marty wanted to know how the affair had started. He told Marty that he and Pat worked closely together and it just happened. Then he put his hands over his ears. Scher said the last thing he said to Marty was, "You know, this is as much your fault as it is anybody's." Then he heard a yell. He had the gun and Scher grabbed the gun, trying to take it away from Marty. They struggled, the gun went off, and Marty turned white. Scher turned him over, punched his chest, took off his glasses and earmuffs. He pinched his nose. Then he started screaming, "Marty, don't die! Stop! Marty, don't!" But he knew he was dead. Scher said he panicked. He didn't know what to do. He said he knew he couldn't face the public, telling them the truth, so he had to make something up, another accident. So he made up a story about him running with the gun and tripping and falling. He was afraid he would be convicted and would never be able to practice medicine again. So he made up that story and took the gun, wiped off the barrel with a handkerchief. Then he put the gun with the muzzle facing his head and untied one of Marty's shoelaces. So when he was finished testifying, Scher looked relieved, and so did his attorney. Scher had actually done better than expected. He'd been calm throughout his testimony, looking directly at the jurors and making eye contact. But the cross-examination would be so brutal, and he didn't do so well with that, did he?
No, he didn't. But you'd say, first off, why didn't he say this story first?
Well,
it's even
he
more
explained
plausible.
that because he didn't think it would be believed.
Well, I believe that more than I believe the guy tripped and the gun went off.
Right.
Anyway, the state did offer a plea bargain that would get Scher out of prison within 7 years. But Scher, with his wife and stepchildren's support, rejected the offer. They believed the jury would acquit him. In the days following the plea offer, however, the defense attorney called a woman who stunned the courtroom with her testimony.
Yeah, so this was Cindy Klein, and she had been the Dillons' 15-year-old babysitter at the time of Marty's death. So she testified that a week before Marty's death, Marty had driven her home after she'd taken care of Michael and Suzanne for the evening. She claimed he was drunk and very talkative. She told the jury that Marty confessed to her that Scher had been having an affair with his wife and that Marty planned to kill him. She said that Marty told her he would take Scher to Gunsmoke, shoot him, and make it look like an accident. She alleged that Marty told her he would be believed because his father was the mayor and Scher was the only Jew in town. Yikes. So when Cindy Klein finished testifying, the prosecution barely bothered to cross-examine her, giving the jury the message that she really wasn't credible or significant.
Yeah.
Then after the defense rested, the prosecution called several rebuttal witnesses, and this included Julie Ann Poff, Cindy Klein's sister. Poff had called Larry and Joe Dillon at home the day after she learned her sister had claimed that Marty Dillon told her he'd planned to kill Scher. And the young woman was crying. On the stand, Poff said that Cindy Klein shouldn't be believed. She said, "She's not telling the truth. My sister has a hard time telling reality from the truth." So the prosecutor asked her, "How would you describe your sister's reputation for truthfulness?" And Poff answered, "Bad." So the very next day, the prosecution rested its case. The morning after closing arguments, the judge handed the case to the jury, and by 10:30 they started deliberations. Larry and Joe Dillon went home to wait. Then at 3 o'clock, the Dillons learned that a note had been passed to the judge. The jury had a question. The jury's request was simple, but it was kind of revealing. They wanted an explanation of the different counts: first and third degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and homicide by misadventure. This was not a good sign for the defense, because why would they even be considering that if they were going to acquit, right?
Exactly.
So by 5 p.m., the jury came back with a verdict of guilty, and they had chosen first-degree murder. The prosecutor asked the judge to immediately impose a life sentence on the defendant. The defense attorney stressed that despite the jury's verdict, the family of Stephen Scher stood behind him. Moments later, the judge imposed the sentence of life in prison, and the proceedings were over. One interesting note is that Pat Scher, a.k.a. Pat Dillon, pleaded guilty to lying under oath about the adulterous affair that she and the second husband had during her first marriage. She would serve no jail time for this misdemeanor charge of false swearing. She was sentenced to 15 months probation, charged a $500 fine, and 50 hours of community service. So basically a slap on the wrist, but for me, I have to wonder, what did she know?
Yeah, they were quite a close couple.
They were, both before and after Marty's death.
Yes.
So I find it hard to believe that she knew nothing. Maybe he had told her something like the second story, but I really feel like she had to have some idea.
Well, yeah, just the fact that her husband was aware of the affair, had issued the ultimatum to her. She must have had some inkling that maybe something would happen at Gunsmoke.
Really? Beforehand, you think she had an idea?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think she knew exactly a date, but I think she was aware that Scher might do something.
And was okay with it because she didn't do anything to stop it. So
No.
that's, I'm not sure. It would be interesting if you knew her because I think you'd have an idea.
Probably.
She's presented as this Catholic woman with all these morals and standards, but when you think about her affair with Scher and the way she behaved, she really didn't try to hide it. She was kind of cruel to her husband, if you think about it.
Yes, she
The
was.
way she did it was really kind of rotten. So I wouldn't be surprised if she was in on it completely, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it could be.
It could be, yeah. But of course, the children, they didn't remember their father, so they were on Scher's side. And the $50,000 life insurance, they actually invested that in Scher's defense, which would have been the last thing Marty wanted to happen with that money, right?
That's for sure.
And there were other inklings that Scher was kind of a rotten person. One thing that his ex-wife Anne did bring up was that they had one of their dogs that wasn't really doing well with the training, and she'd been away for a day, and she came home, and she said, "Where's Shadow?" I think his name was. And Scher said, "Oh, I shot him." So just shot a dog like that, which,
Yes.
that's evil.
It's very evil.
That's very evil, yeah. Not a good man, for sure. So it has to make you wonder if Patty was a good person either to be with him.
That's my thinking.
Yeah, me too.
It's time for listener feedback.
What have we got for feedback?
Got a few voicemails and one email. So we got a voicemail from Tony. She has a case that she wants to be presented.
Okay, let's hear it.
Hi, Dick and Jill. It's Tony from Australia calling. There's a case that I wondered if you'd be interested in covering. It's a pretty horrific case. It's about Minna and Una Joe, originating in New Zealand and covering Korea and a little bit of Australia. Unfortunately, these children were murdered and they were packed into suitcases by their Korean mother who lived in New Zealand and put into a storage locker and left there for some time. And they were only found out when she didn't pay the rent on the storage locker. And it's just come to light that she had left them there for several years. Their mother, who I'm probably saying this wrong, Hak Young Lee, was married to Ian Joe. And Ian Joe became very ill and she was very dependent on him, and she became apparently her friends thought, very weak. And she was by his side and so forth and was saying some very strange things. After he did eventually die, and she said she was taking the children on a very long trip, and which went through 2 Hilton hotels in New Zealand and Hilton in Surfers Paradise. But in actual fact, she had killed the children in New Zealand with sleeping tablets or something like that and put them in the storage locker. She then went to Korea for many years and said she didn't even have children and began dating and so forth, and was eventually found out. And it's all back in the news now. She has been found guilty, but she's yet to be sentenced. But it's a really terrible, terrible story. They believe that she's not insane, but it's one heck of a story. And I think you guys do an absolutely great job of covering it. I think it would just be a big, big, deep dive to get into this story. Anyhow, enjoying the podcast as usual. And this will be pretty harrowing. Thanks very much for your podcasts. Bye from Australia.
Thank you, Tony. So we always love a harrowing case, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is.
It sounds really disturbing and sounds like an evil person, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, crazy. So, yeah, I would love to do a deep dive. It is horrific, especially because it's children, but I think it would be worth looking into and could make for some really interesting discussions. So, thank you. We will definitely take a look at that, Tony.
You bet.
So, next we have a voicemail from Louise.
Hi guys, it's Louise James. I'm the crazy woman who recommended the Aaron Patterson case. I didn't mean to leave you two voicemails. I thought the first one, I looked at my phone and it was doing nothing, and I thought that I maybe hadn't hit record or something. I don't know. Me and technology, we're not exactly on friendly terms. But I just wanted to say thank you for actually doing that. I'm yet to listen to it, but I just saw that you have included it. And so I'm looking forward to that one. It's really nice when you make contact like this to know that there's somebody on the other end. So it's great. And also, I just listened to the Elmer Crawford episode. My God, I've never heard of that. So that's a good find, and it was very interesting. So thank you for that one too. And thank you for everything you do. Okay, bye.
Well, thanks, Louise. Actually, Aaron Patterson, that's one of my favorite ones we've done in a while. And we did get a lot of feedback on that. So that was fascinating. Also, it was more recent than usually we're digging years ago to find original cases. But this one was quite recent. Australia had a podcast, like several episodes about her trial. So there was just a ton of information to access, which made it pretty easy for us. So I appreciate your input there.
And then we've got another voicemail from Giovanna.
Hi, Dick and Jill. How are you? Well, I'm so glad that the summer's over, and now my favorite time of the year is fall and winter. And you guys coming from New England know how much I love the leaves turning. I just wanted to call you. It's Giovanna. Thank you for saying my name right. And I am so happy that Donald Edison was convicted of murder, of her conspiring to murder her son-in-law. Oh, it's just like, oh my God. I was so impressed with the Markel family's impact statement, especially the father, how Donna's scheming ruined so many lives, including her grandchildren. Well, I'm hoping now that Dan can rest in peace, sort of. I would like to see Wendy in prison as well. But, I guess you have to take what you can get. But we'll see. But I really do think Dan now can sort of rest in peace. And my heart goes out to his two beloved boys. They deserve to grow up with their father, as well as the other children who she roped into this. They deserve to grow up with their parents and as well. Just shows to show you the harm that we do to each other. Well, thanks a lot again. Just wanted to give you the update, which I'm sure you already know about, but love listening to the podcast, and keep it going. We'll see what happens.
At this point in my life, I'm obsessed with the Adelson case. I was thrilled also to see Donna be convicted. I think there was no way she was not going to be. The amount of evidence they had, it's just, I guess it really helped that she tried to take off for Vietnam, and that helped them. But otherwise, I just think they had plenty of evidence to do it sooner. And I'm waiting for Wendy to be arrested. So if you're not familiar with the Adelson case, it was back on July 18th, 2014, when Florida state law professor Dan Markel was shot and killed in his Tallahassee garage in a murder-for-hire plot that was linked to a bitter custody dispute with his ex-wife, Wendy. So over the next 10 years or so up till now, investigators uncovered a conspiracy that involved Wendy's brother, Charlie Adelson, their mother, Donna Adelson, and then 3 others, 2 hitmen, and Charlie's girlfriend, Catherine Megbanwa. So one of the hitmen pled guilty, the other was convicted. Katie was convicted in 2022, and then Charlie was convicted in 2023, and now the mother, Donna, was convicted in 2025. But the motive was to allow Wendy to relocate with her children to South Florida, which Dan Markel did not want and had actually legally blocked. So now we're waiting to see if Wendy's going to be arrested, because she has been named an unindicted co-conspirator, and I think there is enough evidence for her to be charged. So that's what we're waiting to see, is will Wendy be arrested and tried for Dan's murder? I've watched so many interviews and analysis of what Wendy did, and especially that drive that she took down by Trescott Drive, where she claimed to drive past, then she claimed to turn a little. But then, I don't know if you've seen on YouTube, there are like 3 or 4 people that took the drive and actually show that from that corner she was talking about to where the house was is like 0.9 miles. So there's no way that she just kind of turned a little and saw the tape and left. Also, it wasn't just the tape. There were several police cars. The house was roped off. Sirens, well, at least lights were going. So, yes, that is one person I'd like to see arrested, and a trial I will definitely watch. So thanks a lot for your contributions. We appreciate it. And let's go to the next one, which is a voicemail from Dallas.
Yes, you recall, and you were wondering what happens to older inmates in prison. And Dallas has the answer, or an answer.
Excellent.
Hi, this is Dallas. In one of the recent episodes, The Final Arrangement, I know Jill had mentioned wondering what happens when people get super elderly and they're in prison. My husband works as a detention deputy in the county jail, so he knows. And
Hello, I am husband of avid listener. I'm a detention deputy for the county jail in Central Florida where we live. I am specifically, right now at least, in charge of the elderly and infirm wing of our jail. In there we do house inmates currently older than 65 years old, inmates that require medical equipment, disability, and it's also orientation for any inmates who are arrested under substance charges. It's a direct supervision pod. I am right there in the middle of all of them. This enables me to have quick access to any inmate during any medical emergency. Also, running differently from any other wing in the jail, I have constant communications throughout the day with medical and additional visits from medical, as well as priority on sick calls and any issues that arise. I often have to call medical emergencies and send inmates out to the hospital via EMS, which is only possible because I'm right there in the middle of all of them. All the medical equipment, with rare exception, is owned by the jail, but walkers, canes, crutches, wheelchairs, they're assigned to inmates who do require them after initial medical screening, and they do keep them all on the housing unit. They're not allowed on any other housing unit as long as they have medical equipment requirements. We also have inmates who are disabled, paralyzed. They have full care while they're here, and if there is any worsening conditions, they're sent out to the hospital to receive the additional care they need. Nurses come and change them over, clean them, take care of their needs, in addition to the regular medications and screenings. So, yes, there is a different standard for old and infirm inmates. They're not just out in general population with anyone else unless they've been medically cleared to do so. And they do receive additional care and treatment while they are there. They're still on the hook for their charges, but they are separate from the rest of the facility.
anyway, hope that tells you what you wanted to know.
Thank you so much. The dogs are getting restless. So yeah, that's our home. That's what it's usually like around here. But thank you so much for that input. I really appreciate it because, of course, I thought there had to be a place, right? Because some people are in prison and are not well or are disabled and have various disabilities. So what a job people do to take care of these people. I'm impressed. And I really appreciate the information. Any comments on that, Dickie?
No, you said it all.
Okay, well, the dog said more than I did at that point. It got quite noisy.
Well, they just wanted to go out.
Well, it gives everyone an inside look to how we normally live. The quiet here at the quiet end is actually quite rare in our household.
Fleeting.
Yes. Okay, so one more piece of feedback is an email.
We have an email from Sloan.
Okay, so Sloan writes, Hi, Jill and Dick. I love listening to your podcast. I was a little late to the party at the quiet end, just started listening this June. but I found myself cruising through the episodes fairly quickly. I appreciate the research and details you put into the podcast, as I know it must be very time-consuming. I wanted to reach out to you to tell you about a case here in Colorado. On Mother's Day in 2020, Suzanne Morphew of Salida, Colorado, went missing. At first, law enforcement believed that she had been abducted when they found her mountain bike and helmet, but they quickly determined that the scene was staged. Suzanne's husband, Barry Morphew, was charged with first-degree murder before Suzanne's body was recovered. Barry was released on April 19, 2022, when his charges were dismissed without prejudice, which means they can bring it back again. In June of this year, he was once again charged with the murder of his wife and was recently released on bond after some of his supporters raised the money for him. Crazy, I know. Anyway, if this piques your interest, I think it would be a great case for you to cover. Thanks for taking the time to read this and for creating such an awesome podcast. Much love from Colorado. Well, thank you, Sloan. I'm aware of this case, but I really haven't gotten deep into it. I have been thinking we'd like to go and be at a trial and report from a trial for something fun to do. But I think in Colorado, they don't televise them. At least they didn't with the James Craig trial, which was in Colorado. Anyway, definitely we'll keep an eye on it because it's something that we probably will cover at some point. I'm just really shocked with the getting out on bail, though, because from what I do know about it, he does seem guilty.
Well, I know we've been sort of hovering around this case.
Yeah.
Piqued your interest. So I expect once we get through the trial that we'll be doing it.
Thank you, Sloan. That's a great recommendation. Thank you all for your input. We really appreciate your feedback. Keep it coming. We'd love to hear more of your recommendations and your comments. It's a lot of fun for us to hear your voicemails and read your emails. So until next time, we'll see you at the quiet end. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.